Hello and welcome to this introductory video about how to accompany psalms on the organ. This is going to be a video in two parts. Firstly, a section about the organ for those of you who are less familiar with it and perhaps are coming from a keyboard background. If you are familiar with the organ, you're free to skip this part of the video. The second part will be an explanation of some of the tips and tricks that I can advise that you use. So, to start with, an introduction to the organ. How does the organ differ from the piano? Well, at first it seems there are some similarities. We've got a standard keyboard with 12 keys per octave. We've got about 5 octaves worth, which is slightly less than the average piano. Immediately there are a few differences. The first difference you might notice on most organs is that a lot of organs have more than one manual. So there might be more than one set of keys. Another difference most organs have is they might have a pedal board which looks very much like it has the same keys as one of the manuals. And the other thing that you'll notice as soon as you go to play it is that if you try and play something, there's no sound, even though I've turned this electronic organ on. What's happening there? Well, the best way to imagine it is when you play the piano, when you press a key, a string is hit by a hammer, or maybe 2 or 3 strings, but they all sound one very similar note. Now on the organ, we have pipes instead, and so if I engage a set of pipes, I can make it sound. The difference with the organ is that rather than just having one set of pipes, most organs have multiple sets of pipes, and so we have a stop to stop the sound when we don't want to use it, so that's why they're called stops. And so we can release the stop and play the sound. Now that gives us tremendous control about which sets of pipes we're using. Now if you've got an organ in your parish, you can of course play around with these and find out what they sound like. As a general rule, most of the stops with names like principal or diapason, they're going to be moderately loud, a sort of classic organ sound, really. Like so. Stops with names like flute, the pipes for those are wider and they sound a lot more ethereal. There are some pipes on the organ which have names like instruments from an orchestra. For example, there's a viola di gamba, and you'll also find other stops with similar orchestral names. They have more of a string quality. And finally, there will be stops which have the names of reeded instruments or brass instruments, and they'll often be red on the actual stop font. And the difference with these is that rather than being a flue pipe like a whistle that you might blow, they have the same type of reed that an oboe might have, and so they have that characteristic sound which is quite similar. Now there are some other stops on the organ as well, and we'll come to those in due course. But firstly, the manuals. Why do we have more than one set of manuals? The primary reason for this is if you have a large number of stops, it becomes really helpful to have the flexibility of being able to play perhaps something loud, then something quiet, and then something loud, or alternatively to play melody and accompaniment, or a variety of other things, accompanying choir, accompanying the whole congregation. Now this, as it turns out, will be very useful for accompanying psalms. If you have a 2-manual organ, the most likely names for those manuals in the UK will be the great and the swell. The difference between these will generally be that the pipes on the swell are enclosed. What does that mean? What is enclosure? Well, if you play a pipe, if you've ever played a whistle, you'll know that if you blow less air into it, not only is it quieter, it actually gets flatter as well. And the same is true for the organ. All of the pipes on the organ need a constant air pressure to maintain their tuning. And what that means is that it's really hard to change the volume of the organ. You can add more or less stops, but there does come a point where you want a bit more control. One of the reasons for having a separate manual, therefore, is that some of the pipes can be enclosed in a big box with some shutters on the front, and then one of the pedals that I can use here can alter the volume of that sound. So I'll give you an example of this. And so by using one of those pedals, I can change the volume. That will also prove important for psalming. But of course, the main reason we don't enclose all of our pipes is because it makes the whole organ slightly quieter, even when you've got the shutters fully open. And that's why the grate, on the whole, will have louder pipes than the swell. The other thing to think about is the individual stops are attached to a particular manual. But what if I want to play, for example, this oboe, which is on the swell, and I want to play it on the grate instead? Well, this is where this comes into play. This is what we call a coupler. The coupler allows you to play all of the stuff would be on the swell and play it on the grate instead. There are lots of different types of couplers. For example, with the pedals, there are couplers which can make the sounds from the swell and the grate play on the pedals, which can be very useful and can build up a much louder sound if you want that as well. In general, this might be of use to us in psalms as well. The other thing which you will notice as you play the organ, if you've come from a keyboard background, is that the keys do not respond in the same way. You cannot get more volume out of the note by pressing it harder. You'll therefore notice that most of the best organists, they never have a huge amount of force when they're playing the organ. Most of the organ can be played with quite a gentle amount of force, and this generally avoids mistakes as well, and it's generally less tiring for you as the player. With all of that said, let's move on to the second part of this video, which is to give an example. I'm giving this example, which is the psalm, "O give thanks to the Lord, for his mercy endures forever," which goes at a number of points through the cycle, but this particular verse set is for Pentecost Vigil. I'm going to give an example of how one might choose to accompany this. The first thing to think about is what type of organ you've got. If you've got one manual organ, that will be a bit limiting in what you can do, and you're going to have to change the stops quite a lot. If you've got a two manual organ, you're in really good stead. The first thing to do is to think, what sound can I put on the swell that will accompany my singer or soloist or cantor or choir, depending on who is singing the song. In general, this will be quite a soft sound. So, on this particular organ, I generally only accompany with the two flutes. Those are by far loud enough to accompany a solo singer. Let me give you an example. Let the redeemed of the Lord say this, was he redeemed from the hand of the foe, and gathered from far off lands, from east and west, north and south. And you can see that I'm a fairly loud singer, and that is an acceptable volume and will mean that the congregation can hear the words that I'm saying as well. However, when you are accompanying the response for a responsorial psalm, you want something that will support the congregation, so something a bit louder. And so for this, I would recommend that you play on the grate. Let's include the principals. Let's go with two of those. And I've coupled down the swell as well, so that's nicely balanced. And we can decide if we want any more, depending on a number of factors. You can have a look over the balcony, see how many congregation are actually present, and you can adjust your registration appropriately. You can also think about the individual psalm that you've got. This psalm has a fairly general theme. If you had a psalm which perhaps had a military theme, there are lots of psalms which have that theme. You could perhaps use some of the reeds, some of the red stops. Alternatively, you can choose some of the fractions or mixtures which add a particular sound. What we're going to do now is try out a bit of the response. the Lord, for his mercy endures forever. And you can see that that's a much louder sound that has been produced there. There are a few stylistic things that will be helpful for you. The first thing is what type of accompaniment you're providing. For the singer or the cantor, especially during the verses of most responsorial psalms, including those in the Fisher Psalter, are set in a free form where the cantor is really in charge of the pace and the setting of the words. It allows them to read the words in a more natural way, like they were reading it without music. For example, just as a point of comparison, a singer might do something like this. Let the redeemed of the Lord say this, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. There are some styles of chant where that is the accepted style, notably in Orthodox chants, the accompaniment chant. Actually, it's very acceptable to do an incredibly metrical recitation. But to most Western ears in English, we expect that the prosody of the words, that is, the timing of the words and the pacing of the words, will be maintained. So your job as the accompanist is to allow for your cantor to do that. So a cantor might sing something like this. And gathered from far off lands, from east and west, north and south. And so this leads to a few things that you should do. The first thing is to be quite familiar with the chant that you're playing. This means that you can look up at the cantor more frequently and follow what they're doing. The second thing you can do, and this chant has it automatically, but if the chant doesn't have it automatically, you don't have to play the melody that the cantor is playing. The only thing that really matters is that you're providing the appropriate harmony. And so if you've got, for example, a 4-part harmony where the cantor is singing the top line, you can miss out those notes because the cantor, if they're a strong singer, will be able to do that by themselves. This is a completely different matter when it comes to accompanying the congregation, however. The congregation needs direction. They will have heard this melody once, they'll be struggling to remember the words, and they'll need a bit of encouragement. And so the first thing you should do is make the melody really clear. The technique I used there is called by some musicians as détaché. That is the line that you're playing. It's not exactly staccato, but it certainly is not legato. Let me demonstrate what it would sound like if it was legato, and you can hear the difference. If you're familiar with this psalm, that won't have created a problem for you. But if that's your first time hearing that chant, that will be much harder to lock into. And the other thing is that it will be harder to keep the pace. You'll find that congregations do tend to drag on average. That is, that they fall behind what the organist is playing. And so the more legato it is, the harder the congregation will find it to lock into your tempo. And it's really important that you set that tempo and maintain that tempo. Of course, a staccato melody would also not be acceptable for this. There are a few pieces of music where a staccato would be acceptable unless it is asked for by the composer. However, when it comes to accompanying the cantor during the verses, a completely different mentality will be helpful. Because you don't even have to play the melody if you don't want to, you can have a completely legato. In fact, you can join up the accompaniment. Let me demonstrate. They wandered in a barren desert, finding no way to a city they could dwell in. You'll notice how I've been holding that note for quite some time. And that can provide a gentle bed of sound for the cantor to sing on top of. Another piece of advice that's generally helpful is that you can use the text as the driving force. So you should be familiar with the text as well. Preferably you should rehearse this with the cantor. Think about the stresses of the words. The important thing with the organ is that you cannot provide that dynamic expression, but what you can do is through the length of the notes, or the amount of détaché that you provide, you can change the stresses. Let me give you an example of this. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for his mercy endures forever. So what I did there was the détaché was more before the downbeats. Now that's a technique that's been used for hundreds of years by accompanists for psalms, and the reason is because it makes it really clear where those downbeats are. A good composer will have written a response that allows you to do that and to work with the downbeats. I think that's the most important advice. Of course, one thing that you can explore is to use the pedals. What I would say is, if you are a pianist who's never used organ pedals before, don't be afraid to give them a try. It's remarkably easy once you get your head around it. Preferably don't have your outdoor shoes. You can use socks if you want. Some people get some shoes with a bit more heel. But if you're just doing a simple psalm accompaniment, you shouldn't need organ shoes. So you don't need any special equipment. The best technique with organ shoes and with pedalling is just to tap with your toes. Don't use your heel at all unless you really have to. Most organists will tell you the same. So a simple tapping approach. Let me give a demonstration of how that can be helpful. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for his mercy endures forever. So as you can see, this particular psalm is actually quite easy for the pedals. All you really need to do is make sure that the volume of the pedals is the same as the volume of your manuals. The one thing that the pedals will have that the manuals don't have is a lot of their stops will be deeper and bassier. They're designed to be at the bottom of the texture. What I would say though is that it's probably not a good idea to use the pedals when you are accompanying a singer using the swell. The reason for that is, to come back to the earlier point if you watch the first half of this video, the swell is an enclosed manual, so it will naturally be quite quiet compared to the unenclosed pipes on the grate and the pedal. And so the pedal can become quite overwhelming if you play that, even if you've only got one stop. And I will demonstrate this by comparing the two flutes on the swell with just the one sub-bass stop on the pedals here. Let the redeemed of the Lord say this, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. And then if we have the coupler. And gathered from far off lands, from east and west, north and south. The effect will become particularly prominent if I have to close the swell box till to make the swell quiet. They wandered in a barren desert, finding no way to a city they could dwell in. And so with that, you can see how pedal might be appropriate, but in general, especially if you have to make the accompaniment quiet as a whole, it will be quite difficult to make the pedal accompaniment quiet. I hope that this has been a useful video for those of you who are new to the organ specifically. Most psalms that can be played on the organ can also be played on manuals only or just on the piano, and most psalms will be written with a variety of instruments in mind as well. So the thing with psalming is to use whatever resources that you have available. The other thing also to say is that a good psalm will sound all right even without accompaniment, even if it's just the cantor. And so if you're trying to build a psalm culture within your parish, the best thing to do is just to start off with singers. You can think about accompaniment later. Thank you very much.